Welcome, everybody, to today's session. It's titled From Ink to Impact, Navigating Trends in Digital Printing and Finishing. We're fortunate today to have a couple of people who are really smart about this particular topic, who volunteered their time. The first is Ashley Gordon of HP, also the host of the Context series, which is going to take place again next week in London, if you're going to be at London Book Fair on Monday. There are very few remaining spots that you can squeeze in, but a really good place to learn about a number of different things happening in the both printing and sustainability. And Joe Upton from Gasch Printing. Joe is a longtime friend of BISG, dating back to his days when he was selling for printing for Edwards Brothers Malloy. And Joe, Ashley, thank you for making the time today. I know you each have a conversation that you want to kind of foster. And why don't we get started with that? And then, folks, if you want to ask questions or make points, the chat is the right way to go, and we'll be looking at that and coming back to you. And if Ken finds your question either really interesting or overly long, he'll ask you to unmute and join the conversation. So, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Ken, did you have anything to say, or you want us just to jump in?
No, jump in. I'll get my chance later.
Okay. All right. Well, Joe very graciously offered to let me go first. So I'm Ashley Gordon, as Brian said, from HP. I'm the publishing segment manager, and what that means in non-HP speak is that I spend half my time with book printers and half my time with book publishers. And I help the division of HP called PageWide that produces the industrial size roll-fed inkjet printers understand what technology to build so that we can help our customers, like Joe would be, help their customers, which are publishers. And I sort of sit in the middle of the supply chain discussion from the perspective of what publishers are trying to accomplish and what's impacting them, and what services and products book printers are then trying to produce. So thank you, Brian, for giving us the opportunity to be part of the discussion. And where Joe and I wanted to start was sharing the idea that there are two perspectives on this topic today. One of them is quite relevant due to the T word, which we don't want to go into deeply necessarily, so that's another lunch and learn. But there are influences on publishers' production and distribution strategies, from tariffs to European environmental and safety regulations, to all sorts of supply chain disruptions, whether it's labor or the Suez Canal or the Red Sea, and also demand uncertainty, where if your book got discovered on BookTok and it's a 5-year-old book and you don't have it in inventory, then being able to prepare for those kinds of unknown demand surges requires you to think a little bit differently about your production strategy than you might have, say, 5 years ago. And the other reason this is particularly relevant today is because just last week, a lot of the book printing industry converged on Lucerne, Switzerland, or Hunkler Innovation Days, which is every 2 years a trade show about inkjet production specifically, but not just print. It's also workflow and it's finishing. And if you haven't thought about your production strategy, including print, including inkjet and digital, in the last few years, then you probably are not aware of the technological advances and how much it is changing. So we have two really good reasons to talk about this, even though you may think, oh, I already know offset, I already know digital, I'm not really sure why we're doing this again. It's because things have changed. The influences on production strategies have changed, and the technology itself has changed dramatically in the last few years and is continuing to change at a pretty rapid pace. So we're going to look at it from those two perspectives, but we're going to do that by looking at scenarios and the way in which digital production versus offset might be a good idea. And Joe and I had a dry run at this a little bit, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago in New Orleans, which would be the home of the largest Mardi Gras, but not the original Mardi Gras. So here's my nod to Fat Tuesday today. Happy Mardi Gras to all those who celebrate. We were at the PubWest BMI conference, and there was a panel on just this very topic. So we've had some experience very recently at looking at scenarios. So Joe, I think we had decided we're going to start with a baseline of definitions, and then going into what those definitions mean and how publishers would use digital versus offset.
Yes. So real quickly, for those of you who don't know me, as Brian said, I spent most of my career, I actually got into the industry 40 years ago this year. And about 2/3 of that time I was with Malloy, which was my family's business, a book printer in Ann Arbor. We were an offset printer. We merged with Edwards Brothers in 2012. And unfortunately, that company did not survive for more than 6 years. But my background for most of my time was in offset printing, and mostly one color and two color. Average runs were 4,000 copies. And then for the last 5 years, I've been with Gasch, and we are an all digital book printer. We don't have offset. So I've kind of been fortunate to kind of see both sides of the print business. And I think to Ashley's point, if you haven't really visited a digital printing scenario strategy in the last 2 or 3 years, it probably makes sense to review it. It may not be right for you, but it's worth kind of getting up to date on what the options are. In terms of definitions, in this conversation, when we talk about POD, print on demand, we're talking about a scenario where the book is sold and then it is printed and sent to the consumer. Short run printing, you can anywhere from a few copies to 2,000 copies. And then we'll just refer to offset as greater than 2,000 copies. Another term that is, I think, it's been around for a while is distribute and print. So you distribute the file so let's say 95% of your sales are in the United States, but you're selling in Europe or the UK. You're sending the file to a printer in the UK to print it closer to your end consumer. So that's distribute and print. So those are kind of the three or four terms we'll be using for the next few minutes. Ashley?
So Joe, give me some ideas, if you would, of where that short run printing particularly, let's start with what most people are familiar with. So let's say it's anywhere from 50 copies to your 2,000 crossover point, although I think when we get to some new technology, we might fudge that a little bit. What are the best applications for the 50 to 2,000, just to give us the starting point?
I think the two that come to, they really revolve, well, there are two. One, it revolves around inventory management. So you're really trying to print to demand. So whatever your demand, you're printing, are you selling 25 books a month, 50, what is the number? And then you're printing you're trying to find the balance between unit cost and lean inventory. And so you're in that range of quantities, somewhere between 50, 10 is not unusual in an auto replenishment model. So and by that, I mean, you have books in inventory, you say you put 500 books in inventory, you get down to 50 copies, and there's an automatic trigger to say, we're going to print X number. It could be 100, it could be 500, to put them back into inventory. But that number is really targeted to a sales history. And so you're using the digital printing to just maintain to keep the book in stock, keep it available, but lean inventory. Another scenario that for us as an all digital printer, we see a fair amount of, just say scholarly publishers, where the demand for their title, they know may not even be 4 figures in its lifetime. And so they'll print 100, 200 up front and quickly go in, they may go right into a POD model on reprints. So the two scenarios, inventory management, and then a frontlist title where the demand is known to be pretty small.
And what about the one where we were thinking of social media, BookTok? What about unexpected demand? And one of the terms in the industry would be gap printing.
Yeah.
How about that one?
So that, and again, that's, well, that'll be interesting things, see how things play out with tariffs. But what we've seen in the last few years, so the two scenarios there, like you talk BookTok, a book just all of a sudden catches fire, and the publisher they didn't anticipate it, so they go to an offset printer and they put in a 5-6 figure print run, but it's going to take 6 weeks to get those books to their warehouse. So they'll go to a digital printer to print a small quantity and maybe repeatedly, just to feed the initial demand until they fill that gap till the larger run comes in. That's also happens overseas, where books are being printed overseas, and it's a lead time is many weeks, and they want, and this is more common with 4-color books. They just need 1,000 copies to tide them over until the ship arrives. So those are the two kind of gap scenarios.
And I think I see a question popping up that Ken is helping to fill the chat. So Joe, we've mentioned several scenarios. Could you give us some idea of the publishers who are using these scenarios? Large, small, we're only talking trade paperback mono, or it might be color. What are some of the parameters around using these scenarios so that a publisher could help identify themselves in others that are doing it?
I think the first answer is all publishers are doing this. You don't have to be a certain type of publisher, a certain size publisher to utilize these scenarios. The publishers that, smaller publishers that may not have or don't have a bestsellers, they're more of their titles will be printed short run digital than maybe a larger publisher that's publishing with a very active front list. But it's all publishers are utilizing this, and I think it's a function of demand. What you're trying to tie your supply strategy, your print strategy, to the demand for your books, whatever that demand is. And when the demand is, take this gap scenario aside, when the demand is dozens, maybe hundreds a year of units being sold, that's where digital really helps out, because you're minimizing your inventory, your investment in inventory, and you're minimizing the opportunity for waste. But to your question, I think all publishers can use this to some extent.
And depending on the equipment of a particular print supplier, it isn't just perfect bound paperback with mono interiors. It could, black and white interiors. There's color. There's case bound that happens at very low run lengths. There are some providers that even can do things like French flaps on single copies, that can do embossing, that have a variety of other types of finishing. So I think one of the things to keep in mind is that all types of publishers and all types of books have, to some degree, accessibility to this kind of production. It's most difficult with the very heavy coverage, high quality color, because of cost and possibly because of some quality expectations. But from what we see with publishers, and you mentioned scientific and academic, there are several publishers for whom their medical titles or their other scientific titles, because of that limited demand, they're exclusively digital. And the color quality meets their expectations. And in terms of technology advancements over the next year, there will be new equipment that hits the market, much of which was just announced at HID last week, that is really high-end color with heavy coverage. And we shared a few samples with a very small group of publishers just to get their take. And they were coming back with their art and architecture editor was okay with this, that they were good with it. So I think one thing that publishers really need to pay attention to over the next year is that quality component. It's not just about black and white perfect bounds paperback books.
Yeah,
Would you
that's
say
correct.
that's true?
Oh yeah, very true. So, yeah, kind of any kind of book you can think of, hardcover, softcover, mechanical bind, saddle stitch. Digital printers can do that. It's important though that not all digital printers can do all those kinds of books.
Right.
And so it's important to understand what that printer's capabilities are. Can they do a coffee table book? The equipment allows you to do it, but does that printer have the right digital equipment to do that book? There are limitations within case binding, depending again on the equipment that the particular printer has. I saw there was a comment about, or it might have been a question about edge printing. Some edge printing obviously has taken off in the last year or two. It's probably not a good application for digital short run. It's going to be a challenge for a printer to do that cost effectively because of the make ready time. But I would set that aside as probably most digital printers aren't going to be good candidates for that. But it never hurts to ask. It never, hey, can you do this? It never, and obviously the price will take care of itself.
Yeah, it just is a quick point on the sprayed edges and edge printing. There were multiple vendors with new equipment specifically for that at HID. And it's true, what I've been hearing is that the make ready is too much. It really needs to be several thousand units for it to be worth the while to set it up. But I would say that that's also one of those areas where you want to pay attention, because as the demand continues to grow and as capacity continues to be tapped out, that those manufacturers are going to get better and better at producing the equipment to do those jobs. And so what isn't cost effective today at anything under several thousand units, a year from now, 2 years from now, it could be 50 or 500, and you're doing numbered copies with very special finishing or even custom finishing per copy. So I think that's going to be a moving target simply because it is so in demand.
Correct. And just to circle back to kind of what can be printed digitally is, I think you're compared to 10 years ago, and I'm kind of making this up, but let's say 10 years ago, 60%, 70% of the titles could have been printed digitally with quality comparable to offset. Maybe that percentage was lower. I would say today it's probably closer to 90%. Mm-hmm. So again, most books, not necessarily all books, but most books can be printed digitally with offset, very close to offset quality. And in many cases, you couldn't tell the difference. But it goes back to talking to the printers about what they can and can't do. I also think that while there are all digital printers like Gasch, which we're a niche printer, digital printing is no longer a niche. Most book printers have a digital print capability, and I think, and I'm kind of curious, Ashley, what you saw last week. But I think all printers are looking at digital. if they're looking to make investments in digital. They haven't given up on offset, but it's they're part of their investment, their capital spend is going to be in digital equipment.
It is going to be in digital equipment, and it's going to be an offset replacement digital equipment in many cases, because overall run lengths are getting shorter. And you mentioned earlier in the scenarios the distributed print model. So even though you might have, say, 30,000 units in inventory, they're going to be in inventory in various markets. So you do 10 in one, and 10 in one, and 10 in one. 10 in Europe, 10 in North America, and 10 in Asia. And rather than shipping them, or centralized production and then shipping everywhere. So what a lot of the book producers that we're looking at HID was essentially offset replacement equipment, where you get a crossover point. And so, that point where the digital unit cost and the offset unit cost meet up is more like 5,000 units, 7,000 units, even 10, depending on the trim size and the page count and what the requirements are. So the shift really seems to be, as you said, book printers who can do a little bit of everything. And what I hear from publishers is that that's exactly what they're looking for, that they need all of these different tools in their basket, and they are looking for partners who can help them, guide them, and offer this multitude. So I've got one more little set of questions before it looks, I don't know, Ken, if that's all you or if it's just lots of people popping up with questions. But so Joe, we talked about multiple scenarios, some of which would require a really quick turn to be able to really take advantage of what digital can do. What makes for a good publisher partner? What do they need to do in advance? What do they need to be good at? What do they need to communicate well with you about, so that if they need that gap printing, if they do want to look at print on demand, truly that, post, print post order, what do the publisher need to do to prepare from a file standpoint, from a relationship standpoint? What makes a good partner?
I think, in anything in life, good partner is somebody that communicates well with you, and communication is a two-way street. So I think first thing is communication. What are your needs? What are your expectations? What do your books look like? And like if you're high quality 4-color content and you're very quality sensitive, ask for samples, share files that we can look at and evaluate. And so I think it's open communication about expectations and what you need. I think to take advantage, if you kind of go back to, there was a phrase, life of title, where you may print in a book initially digitally, then it takes off, it goes into offset for a while, and then as demand begins to level out at a low level, it goes back to a digital print method. So for a publisher, understanding, okay, what does the design need to look like in order to follow all that life cycle and print in the different methodologies, because there are limitations. The quality of digital is, as I said earlier, is very comparable now to offset, but there's still limitations. Trims, if you go to POD, you generally speaking, you only have certain trim sizes you can choose, certain papers you can choose. So it's understanding okay, my digital printer, this is what they can do. This is what they're limited to. So I'm going to make sure my design meets that. And then you can go to offset off of that. But kind of going back to your first question, I just think it's just tell us what you need, what you're looking for, and have a conversation.
And maybe don't wait until you get in a crisis point to reach out and make that connection, share those files, get those samples. It's not just about getting a quote. It's about establishing that relationship prior to that production. Would that be fair?
Yes, exactly.
All right, Ken, those are
I've got to.
basics of digital and offset and relationships, and without getting too deep into any one thing. So where is the conversation headed? Where do people want to get deeper?
Well, I've been seeing a lot about cost and quality, but one question, I think that might have been Brian's, is what are some of the newer finishing options that you saw at the Hunkler exhibition that publishers should be aware of?
The primary direction at Hunkler was really about speed and the ability to finish at a high quality quickly. So we, for instance, just to give one little plug, but only because it's an example,
Yeah.
HP had a production line that was doing about 750 books an hour, and it was inline finishing from putting in the file to the book comes out the other end. So the biggest advancement that was at HID was that digital is really becoming much more sophisticated from a workflow standpoint and from a process standpoint. So what book printers will be able to do in terms of turn and capacity will change once those investments are made in this new technology and the new equipment. But like I said, there's definitely edge printing, there's embossing. Joe mentioned sewing and spine sewn. So there is a recognition that higher finishing will need to be available at lower unit numbers.
So were there any interesting offerings in terms of gathering sheets and sewing in the finishing world?
I don't know. I was stuck in my booth for a lot of the time, and I didn't hear that specifically. So forgive me. I'm not sure.
So I was not there, but so just in terms of sewing, you have to have a signature in order to sew it. So at Gasch, we're not able to do that because we're doing cut sheet coming off of our presses. Printers that are folding, often going roll to roll is the terminology, and creating, it could even just be a 4-page, what we define as a signature, to put the thread through the spine. That is, there are digital printers that are doing that now, but it's not. I wouldn't say it's ubiquitous.
No, but it's that point of really understanding what your supplier can do, because there are definitely roll-fed hardware that produces signatures. One of the ones that was just announced was, we can do 8 across, 8 up, 16-page signatures. So digital that is mimicking offset type production and output so that it can marry up with that finishing more effectively. So it really does depend on what equipment the provider has.
So are there any innovations in like digital hardcover binding? Sorry, Ashley, I'm going to get to your printing. I really will get to printing here.
No, that's okay. And I also I know there are people on this call who have expertise beyond my own. So I hope they'll raise their hand if they have the answer that I don't. What I'm aware of are some of our customers who are capable of hardcover finishing in low units. I couldn't tell you what the actual, what's the latest 6 months ago that was just released, but I know it's possible. I just saw Matt's face just popped up. Matt, do you have a better answer to that than I do?
To which part? Sorry.
Yeah, Ken, put it out to the universe.
Yeah, so innovations in digital hardcover, that's always been kind of a sore point, is you can get the digital soft cover done fairly rapidly, but then it was always an extra week to get hardcover binding on it.
Well, I mean, I think taking a step back to what Ashley just talked about and Joe talked about with the signatures and all of this, it's all about each individual manufacturer figuring out what their sweet spot is and having that equipment and it needing to be full for them to make the investment, right? So like at Hunkler, I saw one of our members has a great digital roll-to-roll solution to make signatures and sew, and that's awesome. I mean, I watched it and it's humming, but it's near line, it's not in line. So that means it's got to be somewhere else, and that kind of slows things down. And now all of a sudden, once that now if you got to throw a hardcover on it, well, you need case making lines and other stuff. So somebody's got to be willing to invest all that money, and people have to ask for it. So
Yeah.
not everybody, I think Ashley said it best, it's not going to be ubiquitous. Not everybody's going to have all of that equipment to be able to do everything. So you have to find, our various BMI members that can do this component or that component or this finishing or that finishing based on what you want to do, and they'll be able to tell you, hey, yes, we can do only 100 copies of this, or it has to be 1,000 copies of that. I mean, at the end of the day, these innovations, these changes, the great new equipment that HP is putting out, or the great new equipment that Mechanotechnica is putting out, or whoever it is, it's most printers, and I'll Matt or Joe or Andrew can say I'm wrong, but the equipment is being invested in for two main reasons right now. One is they have an overwhelming demand from the publisher that they need to put it in, or two, it's gonna take labor off the floor, because we've talked about this. I know Brian, you've had whether you've wanted me to or not, I've poked my head in a lot of these webinars over the years, and one of the things we've always talked about is labor challenges in the book manufacturing world. Those haven't gone away. So most people are making investments today. It's because they can now have a fully functioning line like the one Ashley talked about, and have one or two operators, where 5 years ago with a different line, they needed six. And they're able to take four people off the floor because those four people retired, and they can't find four new people to train and keep going. But the nice thing is the speeds are better. So there's been innovations. It may not mean that the amount of books per hour, finished books per hour, has gone up at a particular plant, but that plant's more viable because they didn't have to find four new bodies to help produce that many books per hour, if that makes sense.
Speaking of cost and staffing and productivity, I've always wondered if there was something like a Moore's law of digital printing, where now there has to be where the cost per unit falls 85% every 2 years, or falls 15% every 2-3 years, something like that. That would be something that I would guess that the research scientists at HP would probably have a handle on.
That sounds like a Jason Farrell question to me.
Although,
We get-
so Ken, I answered that one in your chat though, but the one thing we haven't seen go down are energy prices, paper prices, labor prices, transportation costs, which are all the things that go into those costs per unit. So unless those things are all going down, I don't see those costs dropping.
I don't know. You just talked about reduced labor content, so that right there should end up decreasing the cost.
But they just took that money that they saved in labor and spent it on capital allocation. So
Yeah.
you're using the same money differently over time, and they've had to do it because the labor's not there. So yeah, maybe you're saving. You might save one spot, but not the other. And right now with paper the way it is, again, people asked about EUDR, those regulations. Well, paper costs aren't dropping anytime soon either.
Rather than get into a continued negotiation here, which I certainly do with my printing partners all the time, I am curious. One of the comments was two-color printing being charged as four-color printing, probably because of the number of units on the press. Is that a common thing?
For digital printing, yes, because we don't work with PMS colors.
Yeah.
So for that second color, we're using four colors to build the second color. So that's why it's priced accordingly.
Oh, and that's another interesting thing with the high quality that Ashley was talking about. The high quality color, is that being done like with process colors, or are you doing something special?
You're using CMYK, using process colors to get for that. And the inks, the manufacturers, HP, Canon, the others, they continue to get better. So the inks are much better than they were 2-3 years ago.
Okay. One last question on cost. I'm going to say last question. There probably will be some other ones that pop up. How do finishing economics affect the break even of where you go print versus digital versus offset?
And when you say finishing, can you just define that a little further?
So all the binding, the gathering, the binding, all of that. If I'm looking, so as a publisher, if I'm calculating from scales, right?
Right.
Here's my print scales from digital printer versus offset scales, and I can actually plot what the break even is on those scales.
Mm-hmm.
So as there are more innovations, or what are we most sensitive to? Is it the cost of printing, probably, or does the digital finishing figure into that?
The digital finishing definitely figures into that. Soft cover, simple soft cover, yeah, it's the printing. That's the big cost center. But when you go into case binding, now you're making cases, casing the book in. It's a separate step. You just think about fixed costs, getting the machine set up to do 10 copies. It's the same as 1,000. And then if somebody wants stamping or embossing, you have a stamp. You have to literally pay for a stamp, a die to be made. So those costs mount fairly quickly at low quantities.
That makes sense.
And from a technology standpoint, I'd say the printing component of it is moving faster than the finishing component. So Matt mentioned labor, and that also is part of that offset to digital conversion. If you can't find the offset operator, or you're hiring a young person to come and work in the facility, and they want to see progress in weeks, not years. They want to be adept at what they're doing in a matter of months, not years. They're much more attracted to working in a digital environment than an offset environment. So you're both able to attract labor, and you need less of it. And so printing is actually moving faster, and the quality is getting better at a rate that is more accelerated than finishing, which is still very labor intensive. So although we are talking about, are we encouraging publishers to think broadly in terms of what can be done at various run lengths, be aware that the finishing is catching up, I would say, to the developments on the print side.
I was really fascinated to hear you talk about the break even going up so rapidly. Do you have to have a large, I guess you do have to have a large printing to take advantage of the larger break even. Can you say more about what's changing that? Is it just the quantity that you're getting out at one time?
No, it's more about imposition and workflow. It's how many books are you printing at a time? How many pages are you getting across that web width? It's the efficiency of the press, frankly. And it generally falls within certain very standard trade trim sizes. So it really is what we call job basket specific. But the faster and more efficient the presses become, and the more they are sized to mimic offset efficiency, then the higher that crossover point is going to go.
I would imagine that this requires publishers thinking about standard trim sizes and things like that. So that's the third rail of these kinds of conversations.
Well, so if we stay away from the word standard, and this also came up in that panel at PubWest and the BMI event, think rational as opposed to standardized, rationalized. And this begins to impact everything from paper and paper mills being able to produce paper for a book market as opposed to a packaging market, to the efficiency of the press, to the ability of the finishing to respond. So and just listening to, is a 6x9 even a 6x9, or is it a 6.5 by 9.25? And absolutely, yes, I think we have to respect the idea of the book as object, and BookTok is teaching us that if we've never learned it before, that a book has to be beautiful, or doesn't have a book being beautiful, a book being a physical object is something to respect. Does that mean that the unique trim size translates into sales? And if it does, to what degree? And what are the trade-offs? So I want to have a book that stands out on the shelf because it's a slightly different trim size, versus what are the economics? And can I get that digital finishing, digital print run? And so you really have to weigh the advantages and what is it you're trying to accomplish. I think what Joe and I were saying, and we talked about this in our prep, was we're in no way suggesting that digital solution is everything to everybody, but that it has more possibilities than we think the industry probably has recognized in the past. So it's not going to answer all problems. And if you really want certain trim sizes, paper type, finishing, it just may not address those. But to understand what it can address, and to understand why you are making those choices, is it truly about sales or demand? Is it making an author happy? Is it you're a design-driven press? Just making those choices intentionally, as opposed to just doing it the way we've always done it.
Well, it sure seems like with the increased cost of shipping and certainly the increased cost of tariffs, that you could take that gain that you see in the break even and just use it on your pricing, and you'll end up moving a lot more back to the domestic printing than overseas, I would think.
And we haven't even addressed the whole idea of total cost of ownership.
Right.
Joe started off with inventory management and being really smart about that, but there's a lot of economics, and what inventory are you carrying, and how big is your inventory footprint, and so total cost of ownership and mitigating risk is a huge part of that, not just the unit price.
By the way, I'm going to use your rationalized versus standardized. That is a great way to talk about it. There have been a lot of questions about EUDR and GPSR. Could you talk a little bit about that?
About in terms of just complying?
I don't actually know what all the questions are about.
So I'm gonna team Matt up on this because Matt and the BMI have been working on this to help the BMI members. Gasch is a member of Book Manufacturers Institute.
That's
so
great.
So that we can make sure that we're complying and helping our customers comply. It's still I would say murky at the moment, but Matt, maybe.
Yeah, Matt, give us the answer that we've all been praying for here.
Oh, it doesn't apply to any of you. Don't worry. No, that's sorry. I wish I could say that. So I mean, basically EUDR, they pushed it a year, but still people have to be compliant. So all the paper mills are doing their best. It does, if your paper is 100% recycled, you don't have to worry about it because that's not where this law applies. It's about or regulation. It applies to, they want to know where the tree that made the paper came from and exactly where it came from, like within a 10 by 10 grid. So some paper mills are able to do that. Others right now are not, and they're working on it. We're still waiting on some guidance in terms of how that's all going to play out. At the end of the day, it will be up to the importer of record, which will be the publisher in most cases. So you're going to have to be ready. The printer will have to tell you where that paper came from, which will have to get that from the paper mill. So it's a nice, fun information exchange. And I know that Onyx is working on that with the metadata, but I don't know if that's going to be a home run solution. I was going to say Simon probably knows better than I do at this point, being sitting over there.
Can I just, this is a BISG event, so maybe we could just share the BISG perspective and leave it at that.
Okay, but Brian, go
Yeah,
ahead. Yeah, no,
yeah.
sorry, I'm not trying to.
No, it's okay. We're working on it in supply chain. Onyx is ready for it. We understand what the due diligence requirements are, and we believe we have a pretty good bead on what the geofencing needs to be for communicating paper information. As Matt said, the mills are not uniformly ready for this, at least in the North American market, and we need to kind of take that into account. So,
And I think
but it's not solved today.
Yeah, and then GPSR is again, Brian. I don't know if you guys are putting anything out on GPSR. I don't want to.
Well, Onyx was updated the better part of a year ago for that, so we're completely covered on it.
But if any, we've put out stuff to BMI members, to the printers about how they can help their publishers. So if you need assistance with that in terms of risk assessments or anything else, just talk to your printer. They should be able to help you get through that.
just
Hey,
comment
back on the, oh, sorry, go ahead,
just
Joe.
real quickly on the GPSR. So from a printer's perspective, most printers have relationships with mills. And if you go back to 21, when nobody could get paper, those relationships were critical because the mills could only feed so many mouths. So if you're a printer and you've been working with a mill for 10 years, your chances of getting the paper you needed were higher than if you were showing up and saying, hey, can you give me some paper? And so the printers are very reliant on the mills. And I'm not trying to cast blame on the mills, but we're very reliant on the mills. And to the extent that they're able to get compliant, then we can get compliant. But it's not easy for a printer to just drop mill A and go to mill B because they're compliant. There are other considerations that come into play. So it's, as I said, right now it's kind of murky. We're all aware of it. We're all trying to make sure that we're compliant so that it doesn't affect our business and we're able to serve our customers.
So back to economics for just a minute. Again, thinking about that shift in break even, that should result in a big shift in volume from offset to digital, should it not?
Yes. Yeah, I think it definitely should. And kind of going back to something I said a while ago, it's no longer going from a printer A offset to printer B digital. It's just printer A and B both have offset and digital, and they're producing more units digitally than the percentage of their units being produced digitally is going up.
So would you expect then to see publishers being able to have a relationship with a single printer that can switch back and forth? Because we've always had to go between different printers whenever we've had to move technology.
I think more printers are trying to be that one-stop shop.
Yeah.
But again, it's difficult to cover every scenario, every specification scenario. So for one printer to cover it. So depending on the variety of what a publisher's list looks like, if it's fairly standard, rationalized,
Yeah, I love that.
if then they may be able to find one printer to service their whole list. But if it's diverse, they have a mix of art books and trade paperbacks, then they may have to work with multiple printers.
And Ken, one trend that I've seen both from what publishers are looking for and what book printers are providing is partnerships. So if a particular printer doesn't have all of the services, they may work hand in hand with another printer who does. And this is also true across markets. And I know we're generally focused on North America, but for that distributed print model, there are North American printers who then have partnerships with very similar producers in other markets so that a publisher can either work with both consecutively, or they can work with just their North American printer and allow that printer to manage their relationship in the other markets for them. So I think what we're seeing is a lot of cooperation among different vendors to be able to provide to publishers what they're asking for. And to some degree, it means that the printer, the provider, is making the decision, is it offset or digital? It's not that the publisher is asking for it specifically. It's that the provider then can then say, well, this line has capacity, that line doesn't. I'm going to shift it to digital if my offset line is full. So it's allowing printers to be able to respond with more agility and to have more control over their own production floors, so that a publisher can just say, this is what I need. And then they can trust their provider to make that decision.
You know, that makes sense. That makes total sense. One other question. With digital printing, it would seem like there's more opportunity for variable printing, increased customization, increased personalization. Is that something that we're seeing much in trade or any aspect of book publishing, or is that still mostly a marketing sort of thing?
So our experience is we don't see it much in terms of consumer customization. So Ken's book, Joe's book, Ashley's book. We see it more just in registration codes, professional academic titles, where each book needs to be registered. And so we're just a variable code on C2. We're seeing a fair amount of that. But that technology could be used for customization.
Yeah, and it would seem like some of the digital packaging that I've been hearing about, or digital finishing, would allow for different sets of, say, readers for different students or different classrooms.
Yes.
Yeah, fascinating. We are getting close to time, and I don't think I've asked all the questions that have shown up in chat. Does anyone want to come off of mute and ask their own question?
Can I do one?
Yeah.
One of mine, actually. I was interested in the interplay between inline finishing and the ability to essentially deliver a book, whether it's a book of one or a very small run. It feels to me like the more you can do inline, the more flexibility you have to do smaller quantities. And if that's the case, does that also suggest that we're going to see growth of a lot of specialized printers that have, specific finishing options tied to them, rather than the kind of offline or nearline stuff that has been characteristic of book publishing in the past? Does that question make sense to you, Joe? Or
it makes good sense. I don't have an answer.
yeah,
but I think it's a plausible scenario.
yeah. I'm just wondering if rather than printing a book is printing a book, and then if you want to, you gather the signatures and give it to a bindery, which has specialty finishing, that you might need to find the digital printer that can do the finishing that you want in line, because you have sufficiently small quantities.
Yeah. I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Ashley mentioned it earlier. Printing equipment it's expensive, so the printers are looking at how long, what's the payback on this? What's my return on investment? And like edge printing right now, it's not. We mentioned it's not viable for very short run, but kind of for me, and Gasch is not looking to invest in it at this time. But I wonder, is that a fad? And so when you're making an investment that's a 7-figure investment, and I don't know what the equipment costs, but when you're making a significant investment, you want to know that 4 years from now, that equipment's going to be viable. There's going to be demand for it. So to the specialization point is, hey, do I see a slice of the pie that's going to be here for a long time, and I can just service that slice for the next 5 to 10 years? Then printer A will be all in on it.
Right. But it may be, and this is an area where BMI has invested over the last few years to provide directories and quotes for members there. So maybe that would give people greater insight into what's going on in the marketplace.
Talking about the future, maybe as a concluding remark, what would you say are or what do you see digital printing and digital finishing looking like in the next 3 to 5 years? Are there things that publishers should be doing to prepare for that?
You want
Ashley,
to go first, Joe?
what?
That's a softball, by the way.
It goes back to first being aware of keeping their eye on the technology, talking to their printers. One of the interesting things in the last few years, since there are not as many in-office visits as there used to be, there are fewer conversations of what's going on in the industry, what is the equipment that's out there. Most printers that I know, most of my peers are happy to talk about the business and what they're hearing and seeing. So I think it's having those kinds of conversations and talking to your peers and your publishers. What are you doing? But I think is the big thing that Ashley talked about is the break even is going to rise. So whatever it is today, let's say it's 2,000. I threw that out there at the beginning. It's going to be 3, 4, 5,000 copies. And what does that mean? Make sure that you're, as a publisher, comfortable with that.
Very good.
Yeah.
Ashley?
I agree with that, and I think there'll be far more color digital than there is today. That the breadth of segments and types of books that are appropriate for digital will continue to expand. And again, it will be publishers and printers partnering so that it ultimately is the printer who decides it's this or this, and the publisher ends up with a blended unit cost, and it's just this is what I need and this is when I need it. And the printer is able to use their expertise and their equipment and their technology to provide those solutions. But the scope of what is appropriate for digital, whether it's because of water-based inks and inkjet, or shorter supply chain and fewer book miles, or whatever the driving force is, the full breadth of the types of books and the runs themselves are going to really expand, I think, dramatically over the next few years because the technology is just so different.
Yeah, so it's going to get to be where a publisher doesn't really have to worry about what it is.
Exactly.
It can be anything. Yeah, that's great. That's really great.
Where maybe this kind of conversation becomes obsolete because it's just the book is getting made and it's getting shipped and it's meeting quality and turn expectations, and they don't necessarily have to know. Although I would encourage them to go visit. Every publisher I've ever spoken to who has actually gone to a production facility to see how the book is made has come away thinking differently and better at what they do. So not only talk to your suppliers, as Joe said, but because we don't get together, go visit them, go see how they make the books, and go see that they love making the books as much as you love publishing them.
Very nice. What a great way to finish the hour here. Thank you so much for doing this presentation and conversation. I know I learned a whole lot through the hour. Just thank you. Thank you very much. Brian, you have any final words here?
No, thank you very much as well.
Thank you all.
All right, everyone.
For hosting it.
See you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.